Houthi stopped targeting all but Israeli ships in the Red Sea. Trump wants to take back the Panama Canal, and record investment in alternative-fueled vessels. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with our January news roundup, Maritime in Minutes. And I'm joined by our correspondent, Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. To say the first month of the year has been a bit busy for the world of maritime and shipping would be somewhat of an understatement. We could probably fill this entire episode with the week started January 20th alone. But that would be missing lots of other important stories that happened across the month as a whole. So we'll be taking it week by week as usual. And Gary, how did you start off January in maritime?
Thanks, Marcus. I'm going to kick off 2025 with a look back at 2024. My first pick is an analysis of shipbuilding figures by Clarksons. 2024 saw the highest new build ordering activity since 2007. Let's hope that doesn't mean that there's a fresh financial crash on its way. But 50% of ships' orders had alternative fuel capabilities, and 20% had ready notations for alternative fuels. Steve Gordon at Clarksons said the 820 vessels totaled 62.2 million GT with alternative fuel capability, and that was a record investment in such ships. The leaderboard for fuels themselves should come as no surprise, really, to Seatrade Maritime podcast listeners and website readers. We've kept an eye on this order book throughout the year. With the alternative fuel tonnage orders made in 2024, 70% were LNG fueled, that's excluding LNG carriers, compared to 43% in 2023. 14% of the 2024 orders were methanol, compared to 30% in 2023. This shows the jump in LNG popularity and the waning of methanol that we've touched on previously. Ammonia's 25 vessel orders compared to 118 for methanol and 390 for LNG, so quite a long way behind. Clarkson said it expects over a fifth of capacity on the water will be alternatively fueled by 2030, compared to 8% in 2024. We will, of course, be covering the developments in the fleet, order book, and in alternative fuel technology on the site, so keep up with us throughout the year. Marcus, I think you're sticking in a similar area for the first week.
Yeah, I very much am, actually. We kicked off the year with our now traditional Markets Outlook podcast with the team at Maritime Strategies International. The episode covers the broad macroeconomic market and then dives into key sectors of containers, tankers, dry bulk, and shipbuilding. It is the last section I'm choosing to highlight related to the shipbuilding sector. As Gary mentioned, last year saw the highest level of new building ordering since 2007, and with contracts coming in thick and fast, the now dominant Chinese shipyards have been in expansion mode. This has moved beyond the reactivation of mothballed yards, which is what has been happening, and now we're seeing brand new facilities such as the second phase of Hengley Heavy Industries in Dalian, which opened this month, and our correspondent Catherine C. reported on. Commenting on these developments, Adam Kent, Managing Director of MSI, said, "We have been here before." Now that is a somewhat worrying statement for those who remember what happened in 2008 and onwards. Earlier he had compared the recent years to the period 2003 to 2007, where in each of the past 3 to 4 years, one sector has pushed to an all-time level of contracting for new buildings. MSI is not expecting the near record levels of ordering to continue in 2025, but markets have surprised us before, and often in irrational ways. Take a listen to the podcast to find out more. As with the past editions, there is a full 48-minute episode, which is also broken down into 5 more bite-sized market sector-focused episodes, and there are also written summaries on Seatrade Maritime News as well. Gary, over to you for week 2.
Great. In the run-up to April 7 this year, you will see and hear plenty of talk about what will happen at MEPC 83, and after the 11th of April, there will be plenty of discussion about what did or didn't happen. For the IMO to stick to the timeline proposed under the revised greenhouse gas strategy, the midterm measures need to be approved at MEPC 83 in April in order to be adopted at an extraordinary meeting of MEPC later this year, and that allows for entry into force in 2027. So we're very much on this timeline, and it's pretty critical. A proposal for an emissions pricing mechanism for shipping has been submitted by a group of 47 member states, along with the International Chamber of Shipping, outlining a process for ships to pay a levy per tonne of CO2 equivalent emissions That levy will go into an IMO fund used to support the development of zero-carbon fuels and technologies for use in shipping. The proposal will be considered by the Working Group on Reduction of Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Ships, ISWGHG, which is meeting in February. And this is another critical meeting if our IMO is going to take all of these steps and keep on pace to meet its revised strategy date targets. Supporters of the approach outlined in this submission say it will support the adoption of low-carbon fuels in shipping by narrowing the price gap between more expensive green fuels and the cheaper, more polluting fossil fuels. Calculations will be done on a well-to-wake basis, which will be good news for those hoping to use biofuels as part of their compliance strategy. This is by no means a done deal. There are still plenty of discussions to be had on this topic, both ahead of and at MEPC 83, as member states agree the path forward and all of the other elements of global regulation that need to be hammered out in time. Alternative approaches to shipping emissions include a goal-based fuel standard with a set level of allowed emissions per amount of energy used by a ship. And then there will be penalties for using more than your allocation and a credit for coming in below your allocation. Listeners may well note similarities to the EU ETS in that approach. And the EU has said that it will review its own scheme once the IMO rules are agreed and in place. I think it'll be interesting to see how keen the bloc is to give up on shipping's contribution to the tens of billions of dollars generated by EU ETS, but that's a separate story. Marcus, what do you think? Are you a global greenhouse gas levy man or a goals-based fuel standard kind of guy? I thought perhaps we could develop a mid-2000s style personality test for the site. We can see which way our listeners go.
That might be quite fun, actually. Personally, I would actually go for the levy, assuming we know what's actually going to be done with it. I think that's the big key question with this. And there's a big key question is actually what happens with the EU ETS money as well. I'm going to turn my attention to something very different. It's regulatory, and it's in the Philippines, and it relates to the crewing sector. The country's seafarer law, the grandly titled Magna Carta of Filipino seafarers, has had a rocky ride, to say the least. But just under a year on from being pulled from initial signing into law by President Marcos Jr. at the last minute, January this year has seen the signing of the rules of implementation. It's an important step in terms of moving the law forward to protect seafarers' rights from paper to real-life action. And the president said it would guarantee fair medical treatment and access to free legal representation, and ensuring that during moments of vulnerability, whether due to illness, injury, or legal challenges, seafarers would have the support of the Philippines government, all of which sounds absolutely great. But there is still much work to be done. President Marcos Jr. called for government agencies to ensure the immediate issuance of all remaining guidelines and to monitor their strict enforcement. I think it goes without saying that any regulation enforcement is actually key. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Right. Marcus, do you think I would pick a story based solely on the picture used to illustrate it on the site? In this case, I didn't entirely, but it was certainly a factor. Nick Savides wrote on my birthday, in fact, about the looming demolition derby in the container market, as new builds continue to pour in the top of the market, and, well, the bottom looks ready to fall out sometime this year should the Red Sea reopen. Braemar put it in less glib terms, as quoted by Nick, "It is likely that earnings may have peaked from 2024 highs, and we could be entering a period of readjustment and alignment to more normalised trading conditions for liner companies." While Alphaliner was just as glib as I was with, "Buoyant market keeps oldies afloat, at least for now." Alphaliner said the average age of the few ships that were sent to demolition last year was the highest in 13 years, and Braemar had only one vessel over 7,500 TEU going for scrap. Out of the 60 ships hitting the beach, 45 were in the 1,000 to 2,000 TEU bracket, as lines held onto tonnage to try and meet the demand created by those Cape of Good Hope reroutings. Any potential surge in demolition hinges on a return to the Red Sea and will be slightly complicated by the entry into force of the Hong Kong Convention later this year. I think that's in June. The direct impact on container ships may be limited, as Peter Sand said that container ships tend to go to more expensive yards, although I expect there could still be some indirect impact, especially if Suez does reopen and we suddenly have a new economic reality hitting home for bulkers, tankers and box ships at the same time. Then you might find a bit of a scramble for slots at the breakers. But I'm not an analyst, so I will keep listening to those in the know and reporting what I find to our dear readership. Over to you, Marcus, for the next one.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked the picture on that one, Gary. I had fun choosing that based on Nick's Demolition Derby allegory.
Yeah, and our love of racing does occasionally get to poke through on the site, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. Right, and I'm going to turn myself to something rather more serious than Demolition Derbies, and that is the topic of sanctions. And it's one of those things that's particularly characterized the tanker markets over the last few years. Rafts of sanctions have come from the US, the EU, and UK, primarily targeting Russia, but also the likes of Iran and Venezuela. In the final days of the Biden administration, the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, or more commonly known as OFAC, sanctioned 2 Russian oil producers, 183 vessels, mainly tankers, insurance companies, dozens of Russian oil traders, and service providers. It was a list that was described as unprecedented by the US Treasury. The tanker market reacted quickly to the news, in particular VLCC rates soaring. However, this has come off after a couple of weeks. The question has to be asked of the effectiveness of sanctions. They don't actually stop trade, they've simply driven it to the shadows with the dark fleet, which by any measure has been an unwelcome development for international shipping. Will the latest sanctions really be any more effective? That largely hinges on a factor outside the control of the nations rolling out the actual sanctions, but those involved in the trade and buying of sanctioned oil. However, the news just prior to the latest round that Shandong Port Groups in China was banning US sanctioned vessels is significant in this regard. Will others follow though, as it does seem to be out of step with Chinese central government policy? And I think, Gary, you'll be returning to sanctions later in this episode.
I will be, yeah. Just while we're here, just to illustrate that ramping up of sanctions, I've got some stats in my notebook here from meeting earlier this week. The average number of entities per year sanctioned, this is just by the US in the years between 2017 and 2021, was 815 a year. In 2022, there were 2,275, and 2023 was a further 2,500 designated entities. So it shows the real ramp up in what we're seeing in that arena. But that will be my final pick for the episode, and for now, we're looking at the week January 20 to 26. I'm going to cover a few stories at once here, as so much happened in January relating to the Houthi strikes on merchant shipping and the ceasefire in Israel. We had to, like Marcus said, we could do the whole episode on this if we wanted to. On the 14th of January, I noted in a piece that it had been over a month since the last confirmed attack on a ship off the coast of Yemen, and that was the longest period since the outbreak of the attacks in late 2023. Although I spoke to Ambre, and they did tell me that there was likely an attack on December 26th, but the number of UK MTO reports coming out has been markedly lower than we've been used to seeing in the past year, especially in the peak. That trend may be set to continue now, as the ceasefire in Israel has brought a commitment from the Houthi to allow the passage of ships through the Bab el-Mandeb again, except for those owned and flagged in Israel. There is not expected to be any kind of rush back to the Red Sea, though, as so much hinges on the progress of the multi-stage ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Many are sceptical whether Israel will fully withdraw its forces from Gaza, as outlined in the ceasefire, which is one of the conditions for the Houthi ceasing hostilities against Israel. Security experts I've spoken to also point to the risk of a very quick escalation in the area, should either side perceive a breach in the ceasefire terms. And then, if hostilities between Israel and Hamas resume, we could very quickly see a Houthi attack on Israel, which could in turn bring airstrikes from the US and UK on Yemen, making commercial shipping fair game again in the sights of the Houthi. Adding to this already complex situation, Ambre also noted there was a possibility of a return to civil war in Yemen, and the full implications on shipping from that will be on my pay grade, I think. We could speak for hours, but let's just wrap up with a positive story from this area, in what has been a pretty awful time for seafarers. The crew of Galaxy Leader, the car carrier hijacked by the Houthi in November 2023, have been released by their captors, allowing the 25 seafarers from Bulgaria, Ukraine, the Philippines, Mexico and Romania to return home. I can't imagine the ordeal they've been through, not least of all the cases of malaria suffered by some of the crew, but I'm glad to see a positive end to this crew story at last. If you want more detail on any of these issues that I've touched on here very lightly, then it's all on the website under our Red Sea Crisis topic page, and I'm sure there'll be a link to a few individual stories in the show notes as well. Over to you, Marcus.
There's still a lot more to come from that story as well. And I'm going to move on to another sort of multi-story kind of topic, and that's the second term of Donald Trump as US president. Now, I don't think anybody thought it would be boring, but his shock and awe tactics from day one have been dramatic, and a number of also actually related to shipping. So we have the Panama Canal, which Trump says he wants to take back, with all options on the table, whatever that actually means. This assertion is backed up by a claim that the canal is controlled by China. I've seen lengthy articles in the mainstream press analysing this claim, but let me summarise them for you. No, it's not. He also says that US ships, including the Navy, are being overcharged to use the waterway. Writing on Seatrade Maritime News, Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT, believes what Trump really wants is lower charges for US traffic, however. The play is certainly for much more, though. Relations between Panama and the US look to be in for a rough ride. Now, the topic of tariffs. Trump threatened against Canada, China, and Mexico from day one, but this was not made good on. A date of 1st February has now been bandied around, and by the time you hear this, you'll know whether that's happened or not. What is clear from a spat with Colombia over the return of illegal migrants, the threat of tariffs will be a Trump negotiating weapon of choice. How easily tariffs can really be imposed remains very much open to question, but the threat is an easy one to make. On top of that, Trump also fired the head of the Coast Guard, who now seem busy churning out press releases on the repatriation of illegal aliens. I had quite a few of these this morning. I presume the word migrants was apparently just too nice. But if you want some good news, US LNG exports are set for a boost, something our correspondent Barry Parker looked into right towards the end of January. I think it's fair to say the Trump presidency is a story we'll be coming back to.
Yeah, I think it's one we're going to struggle to get away from, right? So as promised, back on the sanction side of things, I was in London in the last week of January for a press event with North Standard, who took us through the current state of sanctions in shipping and the parallel fleet. That's the same as the shadow fleet Marcus mentioned earlier, the dark fleet other people talk about. I do like Mike Salthouse's parallel fleet term, though. To me, it kind of shows this idea of a fleet going about its business alongside mainstream shipping and not necessarily in a dark or shadowy manner, although often in a dark or shadowy manner. Commercial shipping is being weaponized, said Salthouse, who is head of external affairs at North Standard, and gave the example of recent cable cutting by merchant ships in the Baltic, where once dragging anchor through undersea cables was not an uncommon accident. Now it is being viewed as a potential sabotage act by Russia in a hybrid war campaign. Assuming that ripping up of cables is deliberate is a very unfortunate place for us to be, Salthouse said. These incidents were not the main focus of the presentation, though, which looked at the parallel fleet and the implications it has on international shipping. Effectively, the fleet comprises those vessels outside the reach of the G7, although there are various contradictory definitions. Today, though, we're mostly talking about those ships engaged in trading Russian oil, which can be done legally by mainstream ships if the cargo is below the price cap, but most owners tend to completely avoid the trade, just to avoid falling foul of US, EU and UK sanctions. And those sanctions have real reach in shipping, effectively cordoning off the US dollar, and many insurers, majority of which are based in London. About 800 ships left P&I clubs within the international group through April 2024 because of these sanctions. And the impact of Russia sanctions on North Standard's business ran into many millions of dollars, Salthouse said. As the parallel fleet grows, the power of the West slips away, the sanctions become less effective, and risk in shipping rises as this often older tonnage is employed on oil trades without the kind of scrutiny that you'd get from a charter to an oil major, for instance. And it throws up a real challenge to coastal states as well, who have these ships passing by due to their right to free navigation under UNCLOS, and real question marks over how quickly we could respond to an oil spill, for instance, if responders don't know whether they're legally entitled to deal with that ship, if they don't know if they're going to get paid for any work that they do, it all becomes a bit of a mess. There are lots of specifics in the story, and I urge you to go and give it a read, but I'll pick out one line that I liked just to end on with a quote from Mike. We need to find some way of actually incentivizing good quality shipping, G7 shipping, back into that particular trade. Marcus, I'll turn it over to you to finish us out.
Yeah, that is a good quote, and it'd be quite a challenging thing to do in reality. Yeah, to see us out on this episode, I'm going to turn to a subject that the Guardian newspaper in the UK described a couple of years back as shipping's dirty secret. That's scrubbers. We are 5 years into the IMO 2020 regulation designed to clean up ships' fuel in terms of sulfur content. At the time the regulation came in, it was believed that high sulfur fuel would largely disappear. It hasn't, and in fact, the world's largest bunkering hub of Singapore, where I sit, it now accounts for about 1/3 of all sales. Scrubbers that clean the exhaust fumes from ships of sulfur were supposed to be some kind of interim solution, but clearly for many owners of large ships, they have become actually a long-term solution, as they're fitting them into a lot of new buildings. Over half the VLCC fleet is fitted with exhaust gas cleaning units. The world's largest container line, MSC, has them on 58% of its fleet, and others are catching up. COSCO Shipping has gone from 10% of its container ship fleet to 30% scrubber fitted in just 2 years, according to analyst Alphaliner. Environmentalists have long been unhappy about the waste discharge from scrubbers and are now calling for an outright global ban, with Pacific Environment lobbying the IMO. Kay Brown, Arctic Policy Director at Pacific Environment, told Seatrade Maritime News scrubbers should be banned altogether. Data shows that there is no safe use of scrubbers in our marine environment. Closed-loop scrubbers produce concentrated effluent. Both closed and open-loop scrubbers increase particulate matter, including black carbon, and perpetuate the use of HFO. It's a debate that will continue on, but ship owners who have invested hundreds of millions, if not actually billions in total on scrubbers, are very unlikely going to want to stop using them now. And on that note, that's all we have time for on this episode. If you want to learn more about all the stories featured in this episode, links are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.